Can you summarize your company's strategy in 35 words or less? And if so, would your colleagues put it the same way? If you ask yourself those questions and don't necessarily have conviction about your ability to articulate your strategy and the alignment that you would get from the team around you, then you've got some work to do.
What's up, everyone? Today we have an awesome episode on Built by Humans. Dave Grow, the president and COO of Lucid, is joining us. And if you don't know Lucid, you might have seen it as a diagramming software, visual in nature, but since the original Lucidschart that they so became infamously known for, they've expanded their product line. I really like this episode because, first off, Dave has been at Lucid from the very beginning, and now they are quite a big company. And so I'm always fascinated to talk to people that are able to scale themselves, in this case, from $0 in revenue to over 100 million. It's just really rare when you find someone who can operate effectively and efficiently at both scales. And I think there's a lot here that you can learn if you're trying to be one of those people. The other thing that I think is interesting, you hear a lot of companies talk about what's our strategy. And strategy is one of these words that I think a lot of times lacks clear and concrete definition and frameworks. And so Dave gets into essentially how they think about strategy at Lucid, which I thought was very easy to understand and to follow. And so lots of nuggets in here. Andrei, would be curious to get your take on what you liked learning about from Dave.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think a lot of the things that you mentioned are the things that I loved about the episode. I mean, the concept of giving your Legos up, finding the right time to pass on key responsibilities that you once held, and maybe even related to your core competencies, making those right hires at the right time, and being hyper self-aware of where you can improve, or really reorienting yourself to the next huge areas of opportunity and getting your hands dirty early to drive that value in that new opportunity is huge. So it's awesome hearing Dave talk about how he did that at Lucid.
Well, let's get on with it and hear from Dave. Dave, what's going on, man?
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Have been following your company for a long time, have been a user myself. And I was just thinking, your last name, that's pretty synonymous with what you guys have done over the past decade at Lucid.
Well, that's a pretty common reaction. And I guess that's better than the playground tease, I suppose I could get about my name. But certainly been a huge growth journey, and the name fits.
That's awesome. So maybe we could just start, give the audience the quick elevator pitch on Lucid so we know what we're talking about. And then I got a whole lot of questions for you.
Sure, happy to. So, Lucid is a visual collaboration platform. We talk about our mission of helping teams see and build the future. And so today we have a couple of different products, Lucidchart, which is our flagship, which has been around, for 10 plus years, for diagramming and visualizing, systems, processes, orgs, things of that nature. Has tens of millions of users and has grown really well. And then more recently, we launched Lucid Spark, which is a virtual whiteboard, which helps teams come together, facilitate brainstorming, ideate, and really, surface the best ideas to drive them to action.
Just looking at your background, I mean, you have seen this company through so many phases. Walk me through, what was it? It looks like 11 years ago when you joined. What was the state of the business?
Yeah, so at the time I was working at a big consulting firm, and Carl, Lucid's CEO, who remains the CEO today, called me and said, "Hey, we've got a great product called Lucidchart, but we need someone to come help us figure out and grow the business." And so I told him I would come for 6 months, and then I actually had other plans, to go to business school and do some other things. But I jumped on board, moved back to Provo, Utah, and joined Carl, Ben, our other co-founder, and an engineer in the basement. So there were 4 of us at the time.
Wow.
And, essentially zero revenue. I think Ben had built the product and had put a PayPal, donate button on the website for a little bit, but zero revenue to really speak of. I think about 10,000 registered users. And, obviously, if you fast forward to kind of where we are today, well past 100 million in revenue, 30 million registered users, and obviously a much more global company.
That's amazing. And I've always thought of Lucid as one of the companies that was kind of like synonymous early to the product-led growth game. Was the go-to-market try before you buy back then as it is today?
Yeah, I remember having these very early conversations with Carl about this. And, Carl's background was he had joined Google early on when Google was, 500 employees or so. And, at Google, I think they sort of talked about you don't build a product unless it's for 1 billion people. And so I think he brought that mindset, to Lucid. And so, we hashed that out in the basement that we wanted, Lucidchart to be in the hands of essentially every knowledge worker. And so from the beginning, we tried to, take out as much friction of that as possible. It's been freemium since day one, has had a generous free plan, to really, get people in, allow them to experience, visual collaboration. And then, hopefully, of course, on the back end of that, we can monetize, and grow together. But it's always been the goal. It remains the goal today to reach as broad of an audience as possible and to make sure that our go-to-market and our product really facilitates that.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, intuitively, right? Like, I think so many businesses are realizing, people want to try something before they spend money on it. Shocker. And you guys have had the benefit of having that insight very, very early on in the business. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you today about was really just strategy. I mean, you have been in a lot of different roles at Lucid. And I think that it's a topic that I think people get excited about talking about. Oh, the word strategy is a sexy word. Like, it's fun to think about. But when it comes like down to brass tacks, like how to define an actual strategy, how to evolve it over time, I don't know that there's actually a lot of consistent discipline around that. And so what would you say, like maybe the first major strategy decision that you guys made at Lucid beyond we want as many people to try it as possible? And then I'm curious to kind of get up to speed and understand how you guys are thinking about it today.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from what was the next strategic decision? It was really that we were going to win on ease of use. And that's tied to that product-led motion that we just talked about. But literally from the very beginning of Lucid, I would periodically do surveys of our users. And I would ask them, tell me one word that describes Lucid to you. And without fail, every single time, the dominant word that would come back is easy or simple or convenient. But predominantly it was easy. And so from the very beginning, that's been our focus. Yes, over time, like we've put more functionality into the product, we put deep power into it, but ease of use has stayed, top of the list because we know that's key, again, to being able to ultimately get to hundreds of millions of users. And so, that was, I think, the next major decision that we made. And, I think in the early days, a lot of the strategy was just very organic. Right. I mean, it was me with the founders in the basement. We were making those kind of, decisions on a regular basis. And in that small of group, you could stay relatively aligned relatively easily. But over time, I think we really had to be, to your point, a little bit more disciplined about it to understand, what are we going to say yes to? What are we going to say no to? How do we win, in this market and so on? And to really start that, I read an article from Harvard Business Review a number of years ago that really stuck with me. And we've continued to use it as a framework, even to today. And I think it's called, can you say what your strategy is? And it introduces this litmus test at the beginning that I think is critical for every company, every leadership team, and every CEO to ask themselves. And it basically says, can you summarize your company's strategy in 35 words or less? And if so, would your colleagues put it the same way? And I think if you ask yourself those questions and don't necessarily have conviction about your ability to articulate your strategy and the alignment that you would get from the team around you in their articulation, then you've got some work to do.
Yeah, that resonates immensely. It's a little bit of a hackneyed example, but I always think of like Southwest Airlines as a great example where it's like, we will be like the most affordable continental airline period. Like that is the strategy. You're not getting the fancy doodads in the seats. Like we're going to compete on price. And I think it's awesome when you have that clarity. I think there becomes complexity, right, is the different parts of the organization. And so like, I think about like, all right, is you're winning on ease of use how you would define Lucid strategy today?
Well, I think it's a little bit more complex than that. And I think it gets to this question of what is strategy? Because I think sometimes we muddle together, a few different types of statements that can help drive alignment within an organization. And so I think there's this hierarchy, that comes into place. You and I think about it, first is what is the company's mission? And the mission is really why you exist as a company, right? Why are you trying to accomplish? And what value are you trying to add to society, right? And so there's the mission. I think there's core values, right? Which is, how we decide as a company, that we behave and how we operate and how we work together. And then there's the strategy, ultimately, which is, really with that mission in mind, how do we win? What are our competitive advantages? What is our goal? Who we focused on, and ultimately, what are combine that all together to how do we win? So I actually think there's a few kind of specific components that we could talk about around. When you define a strategy, what does that actually entail?
Yeah, I think that's a great little. I'm like writing it down. It's like mission. It's like how are we contributing value? What are our behaviors? Strategy? How do we win? How do we accomplish that? So let's get into the how do we win, because I think a lot of our audience is interested in that. I'm personally interested in getting your feedback, having gone 0 to 100 million. What's the cadence that you review that concept?
I mean, you're constantly reviewing it in some sense, but I think from a more formal process perspective, we've done it every several years, maybe every 2 or 3 years. I think when you read like an HBR article, they talk about setting these strategies that are for 5 or for 10 years. Which I think works for traditional companies, but for startups or high growth companies, 3 years is a pretty long time. And so if your strategy can actually endure that long without requiring major modification, that's impressive. But typically market dynamics are changing, competitive landscapes are changing, your internal capabilities are changing, and so for us it's been about every 3 years that we bring together the right group of people, work through this process. And ultimately come out the other side with, the strategy that guides our next actions.
Now, that makes total sense, Dave. And I guess it seems like Lucid is at a place where you guys have had tremendous success and you're coming on to that phase where software companies mature. I mean, it kind of reminds me of, we were talking to the president of Momentive, which was formerly SurveyMonkey, Tom Hale. And they just went through this huge rebrand because they were going after a larger mission now that they were moving to more of a multi-product. And you were talking about how Lucid now has multi-product and you guys started with this PLG. Can you talk to me a bit about how this larger vision, these multiple products have affected your go-to-market strategy, how you think about designing the freemium model and everything in between?
Absolutely. So, so it comes back again to that mission. Right? Our mission is to help teams see and build the future. And so as part of that, we took a step back and we said, okay, who are we serving, right? Who are the customers, that we want to serve really well? And what are their workflows? So we can understand, where we have unique competitive advantage, largely our visual capabilities to help them see and build the future faster. Right. So a lot of it starts with really understanding your customer and then taking, a step up from that. And what emerged from that is that we looked at where Lucidschart was serving our customers in their workflows, and really powerful to help them, design and develop and document, their processes and their systems and their organizations. But as we looked at their workflows, we realized, there's this ideation step that largely happens before that, right? It's when you're deciding what do we want to go do. And then once you know what you want to go do, then you're going to go, change and develop the processes and systems of people, to help make it happen. And so we saw this very clear linkage that could exist. And so we said it's time, to launch a second product called Lucid Spark, this virtual whiteboard that will help with that ideation phase. And so it started with the customer, their needs and our customer value proposition to them, right? Once we had that, then it's relatively, straightforward on some aspects and a lot more complicated on others, right? Because we could look at it and very quickly elevate our message to be, beyond what Lucidchart on its own was, to more of a visual collaboration platform, and to tell that sort of sweet story and this combined story of how you move from ideation to developing, and designing and documentation and so on. So first started with the customer, then the messaging, then how it flows through to our organization. Now, I would say that move from a single product company to a multi-product platform, it changes everything, right? It changes how you build product. It changes, how you message. It changes, how your sellers sell, how you serve customers, how your internal systems work. And so, we're still early on in some ways in that transition, and we've got a lot more work to do. But it does, essentially cause you to take a step back now with a defined strategy, that we're going to win with a suite of products. And now everything has to go through that lens. And so, it's been a major shift, I think, for the organization, but one that I think is going really well. And most importantly, is proved out by the traction that we're getting with customers. And one thing I'll add on this is that a number of years ago, we actually launched a product called Lucid Press. And in that case, we didn't actually start with the customer. We started from our internal perspective around what technology do we have that we could extend into another interesting market. And that led us to build Lucid Press. Ultimately what happened is that between Lucidchart and Lucid Press, there wasn't tremendous customer overlap. Lucidchart was serving more technical customers. Lucid Press was serving, more marketers. And so what happened is that, we were essentially building two different organizations, two different product organizations, two different go-to-market organizations, two different, messages, and fundamentally two different missions. And so it was a major sort of misstep from a strategic perspective that now we've learned from, but ultimately that led us to make the decision earlier this year to divest Lucid Press into its own standalone company, that Lucid no longer is an owner of, because that was the right thing for both products, both companies, both set of customers, because there was very little strategic overlap and so very little reason for them to exist as one company.
So was the strategic miss the lack of alignment on persona? I mean, yes. And what that implications for marketing and sales and
totally right. I mean, I started by explaining that we want every knowledge worker to have Lucidchart, and I think to some extent we said the same thing with Lucid Press. And so in our minds, I think we sort of said, yeah, there's customer overlap here. This is a Venn diagram that is going to increasingly overlap over time. But that was too simplistic of a look at it, because fundamentally who were going to be the first adopters and the most passionate adopters of the products were different. Again, with Lucidchart, it was going to be kind of broader technical teams, software engineers, product managers, business analysts. And then, with Lucid Press, it was going to be, marketers and the groups around them. And so, we got very little leverage, from a customer perspective, from a marketing, from a go-to-market, overall of having the two products together. So that was the misstep.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so a question that I have for you now is, who is your ICP, if you will? Who is that target size, ideal audience that you stake in the ground are first in prioritizing?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because there's the broader mission, which I talked about, which is essentially every knowledge worker.
It applies to everybody.
Right. But at the same time, that's hard for an organization to act on. And so, to your point, you do have to have that ICP, that you're really more focused on, not to the exclusion of others, but you're going to serve that set of customers more deeply and far beyond maybe the other sort of concentric circles that are going to come out around that. And so, for us, again, it's largely that broader technical team I talked about, those who build and implement software and technology. Their needs are very consistent and are well served by visual collaboration because they are dealing with a complex set of issues and problems on a relatively common basis, right? What are we building? How are we building it? How should that be designed? How should that be communicated to others? It also plays, of course, into where this market historically has been. And so as a result, where the existing customers are. Because what we're doing is we're broadening this market, from who traditionally, viewed themselves as, diagrammers or whiteboarders, to a much more, broad audience. And so, it's that group of people, but we don't make a lot of differentiation, from a vertical perspective or, from a size of company perspective, because these needs exist in literally every company around the world. And so it's largely that focus around, the persona and the function, that drives most of our behavior.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I just literally hear some people on my team's voice in my ear like, we can't be everything to everybody, specifically talking about the company size, right? The needs of an enterprise quite different from a 10-person shop. And so from what I see, a lot of the more modern companies, I think about you guys, I think about Atlassian, I think about even companies like Slack, like they are able to actually work with everybody. Doesn't mean they give everybody due attention from a marketing perspective,
right?
But they'll certainly take their business.
And I think it depends on the end user experience, because if the end user experience, who is actually using your software day in and day out, is consistently the same for the most part, whether it's a 10-person organization or a 10,000-person organization, then I think that works. It works for us and Atlassian and the others you described. But a lot of B2B companies are focused on, a much more kind of deeper use case than a broader horizontal use case than we are. And in that case, the needs of a CFO at a 10,000 person company is going to be very different than, the head of finance at a 10-person company. And so I think it largely depends, can you do that, based on the end user experience and how consistent it is? Because if the end user experience is consistent, then it comes down to, can we add the enterprise capabilities around that? Can we add the administration and the security and the visibility and all the other things that, a 10,000 person company may care more about than a 10-person company? And so we didn't do that from day one, but over time, we grew into that, to add that enterprise, capability. But the end user experience has largely been consistent.
Totally. And by the way, it's funny you mentioned that because in a lot of cases, your first couple enterprise customers will even like guide you on that journey, right? They will literally inform all these capabilities that you need to add. As long as you can get that nice base and they grow with you, it'll happen naturally. We were talking to the CEO of Dialpad about that exact thing, how he had, I think it was Motorola as one of his first customers. And Motorola, played that role in being his Sherpa of things that they needed to consider when building out the platform. But I want to switch gears here a little bit because you just touched upon building out for scale. And you've seen, as we touched on, you've been at Lucid for a very long time. You've been through so many different stages. I want to hear more about how you've had to change as the company continued to grow and how you had to take on different roles, being the CRO, being in product, now being a COO. Would love to hear about things that you specifically learned, key challenges in each role, and how you've really had to flex.
Yeah, it's a great question and one I've thought a lot about over the years. I came into Lucid largely as a generalist, which probably just means I had no definable skills, but I had come from consulting where there were a couple things that I learned from that. I understood analytics really well, and I understood how to break down pretty complex problems into more bite-sized pieces. And so, those combined to be a pretty effective combination joining a startup, because a startup is just a collection of ambiguous problems. And so, that was what I came in with. But again, I joined a 4-person company and now we're 800 plus today. And so it's been, a very different, journey along the way. And so at the beginning, I didn't have much instruction, right? Carl gave me the job description, figure out and grow the business. And so beyond that, I didn't have a lot of direction. And so I just started diving in. And I was confident we had a good product. And so, the next step for me was, okay, if we have a great product, it doesn't matter if no one uses it. And so I'm going to focus on marketing. I had a little bit of background in marketing from some side projects. And so I just started, diving in and in the early days, focusing on SEO. And started doing that along with answering every support ticket and a variety of other things. And, things started to grow well. And so, certainly learned a lot in those early days, but those early days was just about getting stuff done. Because if I didn't do it, no one else is doing it. And so, really that was the early focus. And then over time, though, there's been this really interesting pattern for me that was well articulated by an article I read a few years ago, which has stuck with me. And I share it with a lot of people in high growth situations. And it talked about giving away your Legos.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a great one. Written by a great woman who had helped scale, I think, Facebook and Quip and a couple other companies. And, she described this metaphor of, building a startup is sort of like, you're sitting around a table full of Legos and you start putting it piece by piece. But pretty quickly, you realize that if you want to, reach your destiny and scale this as fast, and as hard as you need to reach that destiny, you've got to invite other people to the table. And so you invite someone to the table, but for them to start building with you, you got to give them some of your Legos, right? You got to give them some of your responsibilities, some of the things you've been doing for who knows how long, and to allow them to really flourish. And what happens when you do that is these really interesting questions start to emerge. You ask yourself, right? Are they going to be able to do it as well as I've done it? Right? I've been doing this for 2 years now. I know everything. I know our customers so well. A scarier question, which then you start to ask yourself, is what if they do it better than I've done it? What does that sort of say about me and my contributions? And so along the way, I've had this pattern of building things to a certain point. Often like a generalist can do, but then finding smarter and more talented people and often more specialized people to take it to the next level. And so, there was a day when we brought on our CMO. I'd been running marketing for our first 4 or 5 years. I built a great freemium motion, but it was clear to get to where we wanted to be, we needed someone with B2B experience and product marketing experience and messaging and positioning who really, could elevate our brand to what it should be. And so in one day, I gave away the vast majority of my responsibilities and about 80% of the team I was managing. And you sort of sit back and think, okay, now what? And so you go through this sort of range of emotions, but each time over a period of a couple of months, I sort of had to work through, what is the next big opportunity, that I should help chase for Lucid, or what are the next big risks that I need to mitigate, or whatever it is. And every time there are big things left for me to chase. And the last thing I'll say about this is, in giving away your Legos, it depends a lot who you're giving them away to. One of the things I love about Lucid is one of our core values. We talk about teamwork over ego, meaning we hire smart and talented and capable people, but who leave their egos at the door so we can, work towards the best solution together. I think sometimes when you bring people into an organization, maybe executives in particular, they can be a little bit territorial. They want to sort of put their stamp on things. They need their space to make decisions and so on. And, we've been fortunate to hire just truly exceptional people all along the way, including executives who are down to earth, don't bring that ego. And every time have said, Dave, you've done a great job with this. Can you stick around and help me navigate this as I onboard and start to put my stamp on things? And so that has made, the transition a lot easier every time as I've given away my Legos to other great people.
I love that. It's a great metaphor. We actually used to, as a part of our onboarding, have a literal Lego board with little Legos on it. And we used to have people pick a Lego that resonated with them as part of an allusion to this metaphor. But a question I have for you is you see a lot of people like yourself who I would describe as just entrepreneurs, like startup generalists that can just figure things out, get shit done. And there's kind of two paths that I usually see, or patterns. The first is I'm a 0 to 1 guy. Right. I get something, I might be able to come in, figure things out, get it off the ground, hire around me. And then, I don't want to be a professional manager. I don't want to be like the general of an army. And then there's people that you've went from 4 to near 1,000 employees, just continued to sink your teeth into kind of new challenges along the way. How and when did you decide I'm going to just continue to evolve here versus go do 2 more Lucids in the past 10 years?
I mean, I think that decision is just subtly made every day and to some extent every year. One more day, one more year. Because I think that takes a lot of self-awareness, to recognize, what are you uniquely good at and what do you enjoy doing? And so, I think I applaud people who have that self-awareness and decide how they want to operate in their career. On the other hand, I think there's a slight caution to not let it be an excuse, right? Building a company is somewhat a terrifying journey, I think, as a first-time builder in particular.
Oh, totally.
Right? I mean, there's new situations all the time. There's things you've never done. And there's a lot of people relying on you to make the right decision, right? Your customers, but typically even more first and foremost, your employees. And so, there's a lot of pressure and responsibility that comes with that. And so I've had, great people, great peers, great friends that I have loved working with, at some point raise their hand and say, it's been a great journey. I'm going to go back and do it again. And I say, fantastic. For me, I've looked at myself and said, I think I have, some of the necessary pieces to keep building. And boy, it's a little bit scary as I look ahead, 2, 3, 4 years. But I think I can do it, because largely I've got a great team around me. We have the right culture. We have trust and transparency. And they're going to let me know when and where I'm falling behind. And if I am, I can figure out if I can shore it up or maybe not. And I need to go find my next Lucid, but for me, I've wanted to be on this journey as far as I can take it. And I didn't know how far that was going to be at the beginning. When I joined Lucid, I think the title I asked for as employee number 4 was something like VP of Product and Strategy. And had to add that and strategy at the end just to make it really.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're a consultant, you're coming from the consulting world.
And so, but I specifically didn't ask for like a COO title or something like that, because I figured, that if Lucid started to take off, we would bring in a more seasoned COO, who had maybe done it before, who could take it to the next level, and that would be great. And, fortunately, do some great mentorship and the right situations and, some luck along the way. I think I've been able to, grow pretty well into the role. But I also don't question there may come a day where I need to be topped, right, where maybe it is that next journey that I don't want to necessarily do and maybe someone else is more prepared to do. I still don't rule that out, but I hope that I can stay on the Lucid journey as long as possible.
Yeah, that's awesome. How do you drive self-awareness as an executive team into these topics? Like, usually when it's time for you to go, a lot of times that person doesn't know it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And as you evolve, you certainly want to give people opportunities to rise to the occasion. And so for me, it's just kind of an interesting topic in terms of like accountability and transparency. And sometimes it can be hard. It can be hairy, especially in hypergrowth. And so we'll be curious if you guys have found any particular practice to be effective.
It's a great question, and it's a hard one. We do company surveys pretty frequently, and they're anonymous, and we ask a lot of different cultural questions. And one of the ones that's been really interesting for me to sort of grapple with is there's a question, and I can't remember the exact phrasing, but something like, appropriate action is taken fast enough for low performers. Agree or disagree?
Ooh,
and that's a really interesting one. And honestly, It's one of the ones that we've scored lower on, than most other things on that survey. Now, generally speaking, we hire exceptional people. And so I think everyone here has a very high standard, which I think is great. On the other hand, it's a pretty serious commitment to, I think, each other when you hire someone, right? As a company and as a team, you're making a good commitment to someone and they are making a pretty serious commitment to you. And so I do think you have to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think you have to give them a second chance. I think you have to, coach them through and make sure they have the right feedback, to hopefully, grow into that opportunity. So I think that's part of it is being patient. Most of the executives at Lucid have been here a long time. And they were folks like me who have grown up with the business, and that's worked a lot of the time. But it takes patience, right? We all weren't ready to step into our roles at day one, but we've largely been able to get there. It also just comes down to the general culture. right? Again, I sort of described our culture, right? It's low ego, which I think leads to, candor and those sort of things, where you can have those conversations. And part of it is, as I mentioned earlier, I said to you, I've said it all along, even to our executives, hey, I might be top someday. And I say that partially for me, but I say that also partially, for them. Because I think that's a reality that in a high growth situation, we all have to accept that that's a real possibility if that's the right thing for the business. And if it is, then you owe it to that person to do everything right by them, to help them, find that next great opportunity where they're going to thrive and succeed.
Yeah, I love that. The first thing that comes to mind as you say that is just how powerful it can be to just kind of have the humbleness and grace to allow people to have the conversations that need to be had. That level of awareness and expressing that is giving someone an opportunity to have a hard conversation that they might not have if they otherwise weren't created a safe environment. And so that's awesome, man. And the other thing I honestly can't help but think about, just when I talk to people that have built businesses in the Salt Lake City area, it's just a generally low ego place. I mean, you compare that, just the demographic and the culture of a lot of people that live there. It's different than the San Francisco, I want to get rich ASAP tech vibe, or New York, or some of the places that I live in. You can feel it. It's just awesome to hear some of the kind of benefits of that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I love the startup community where we are. I think it's a very gritty group of entrepreneurs and builders, who want to do big and great things, but are willing to have a little bit of patience, I think, to get there. Because if you look at most great companies, it takes time, right? I think the average time, to an IPO over the last 10 years has been 10 years, from founding date. And I think we all want it to move faster than that, but it takes time. I mean, that first 0 to 1 million, right, for us took several years, and then it just started to compound year after year after year. But it takes patience, it takes grit, the vast majority of time to truly build a great and enduring company.
100% low time preference. And so, Dave, I can't help but ask this as I hear you talk about your journey and your career. First off, what is the Lego that you're holding on to today? I mean, what do you care most about? What are you spending most of your time on right now as CEO and president of Lucid? And moreover, on that same point, what about your current role surprises you, right? Something that you might have not expected to be a big part of the job at this point in time?
Well, I love go-to-market, and we have fantastic go-to-market leaders in every position, marketing and sales, customer success, at Lucid, who are smarter than me in just about every way. That said, I love digging in with them. I love architecting this sort of freemium to enterprise motion. It's a relatively complex motion, right? We talk about sort of the ease of use and reducing the friction for the end user and the buyer, and we try to do that at every step. But to succeed in that is actually pretty complex operationally. And so that's an area I continue to lean in, and I think will, for the foreseeable future. As it relates to what surprises me in this role, one thing that I think I just often have to remember is that a lot of people, now that's given the size we are, don't have a lot of personal interactions with me. And so I have to be very thoughtful and mindful about every interaction I do have. Because, that one phrase that I use, or that couple sentences, or, whether something is portrayed positively or negatively, can leave an impression, with that individual. And I think we're so careful about our culture and investing in our people here, that sometimes that's a little bit of a heavy weight and responsibility, to recognize. And I'm just so fortunate to work with such a fantastic team that I want to make sure that every interaction counts.
I think such important self-awareness as an executive. A lot of times you could say something, not think it's a big deal, but that might be a huge deal to somebody else just due to the consistency of interaction. Dave, well, we got time for one more question here, and then we got to wrap it up. What is a would you say is a counterintuitive view or unpopular view that you have about building and growing a business?
I still believe that there's a lot of value to an office and having in-office, culture. And, I think there's sort of this misconception that sometimes exists right now that if a company wants employees in the office some of the time, that it's somehow a reflection that the company doesn't trust those employees. And for me, that's not it at all, right? It's a fundamental belief from the culture that I've experienced in the last 10 years at Lucid, that being in person, I believe, allows a culture to be infused more deeply, relationships to be built on a different level, and creativity to be more efficient. And, it doesn't have to be every day all the time. That's not the way we're operating moving forward. But I still believe, fundamentally there is a place for the office. And so I think there's going to be, a bit of a pendulum swing. And I think there's going to be a recalibration back over the coming years.
I so agree with you. I was in the office a couple of weeks ago in New York. I don't live there anymore, but I used to. And it's where most of our team is. And, there was a bunch of us in there and it felt freaking great. It was awesome. I love the energy. It was nice to wear a shirt that had sleeves. Like it's just like, it was just a really great thing to be around people again. So I think,
if you agree with me, maybe it's not that controversial of an opinion. We'll see.
Well, I think you want to, I think the difference now is you want to accommodate people's needs, and maybe those needs aren't in the office every day.
Right.
But to me, it's unquestionable that there's value in having that option. Well, Dave, this has been awesome having you on the show. You're an inspiring leader, a wealth of knowledge. We appreciate you sharing that with us. I know there's probably some listeners out here that are like, hey, this Dave guy, he's pretty cool. He's pretty smart. Are you active on any social media? How can people stay in touch with you?
I'm relatively active on LinkedIn.
Nice.
So I hope people will reach out and connect and we can go from there.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode. We'll see you on the next one.